Many of you have taken surveys over the years to assess your own personalities and your personality traits. You might have completed an instrument such as the Myers-Briggs Personality Type Indicator. This leads to a core question at the heart of any study of leadership. Do great leaders have a certain common set of personality traits or characteristics? It's an age-old question that we will explore in today's lecture. Now, we don't only like to evaluate ourselves. It turns out we love to evaluate and assess others, whether it be our supervisor at work, or a leader that we know of in corporate America, or an American president. In fact, we love to evaluate the personalities of our presidents. Throughout history, we have examined them in great detail. And over time, we find that we love to complete these surveys by which we rate and rank all of our presidents. Historians and political scientists complete these surveys, and the American public does as well. And each year, we see stories in the newspapers about such survey results. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and the Roosevelts all seem to rate very highly in most surveys. Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon, and Warren Harding all rate near the bottom. They tend to come out very poorly in these surveys. And then, of course, there are the great debates. Where does Jefferson sit in the ranking? Where does Ronald Reagan reside in these rankings? Well, when we look at these evaluations, we always try to understand why did some perform well and why did others struggle as presidents. Inevitably, we look to their personalities and even to how they were raised as children and to their family environment to understand the development of their personality. How did they become who they were as adults when they were leading organizations or the country? Now, George Washington is one leader that we have studied in great detail over the years. There have been many incredible biographies that have gone into his life, into his childhood, to understand the development of the character of America's founding father. W. Abbott is a historian who has written about Washington at length. He wrote that an important element in Washington's leadership, both as a military commander and as president, was his dignified, even forbidding demeanor, his aloofness, the distance he consciously set and maintained between himself and nearly all the rest of the world. Many people have talked about Washington in this regard. He was not someone who was particularly close to his subordinates, to the commanders who worked for him during the Revolution, or to his cabinet secretaries during his presidency. Ron Chernow is a biographer who has more recently written about George Washington. He said about him, his unerring judgment, sterling character, rectitude, steadfast patriotism, unflagging sense of duty, and civic mindedness. These exemplary virtues were achieved only by his ability to subdue the underlying volatility of his nature and direct his entire psychological makeup to the single-minded achievement of a noble cause. Chernow writes at length that Washington wanted to create the impression of a steady hand. He never wanted to show any of his own concerns or any of his own worries to the troops or to the people. He wanted to be able to subdue in many ways those outbursts that might have, in fact, hurt his ability to lead others. And Chernow writes about how he developed that aloof personality over time. Now, how do you study Washington? How do you understand that aloofness, that desire to be the steady hand who doesn't show the emotional roller coaster that may be going on inside? Well, Chernow and others have studied Washington's relationship with his mother. She was a stern mom who in many ways, even as an adult, was continuing to reprimand him and try to change his behavior. They examine his marriage and his relationship with his adopted children and grandchildren. Biographers try to understand the formative experiences that shaped the man, whether it be his childhood or the way he was educated, or his time as a surveyor or as a commander in the French and Indian War, where he began to struggle with how to lead a group of men in battle. Over time, as we examine these presidents, we're trying to define the virtues and the traits of the great man. In case of Washington, we're looking to understand what are these virtues and traits, and might we look for them in future leaders as we examine the presidents who've led the United States over time. The role of the biographer, then, in many ways is to mine the various experiences of a person's life, particularly their early life, to find the reasons why they are who they are. And biographers can become frustrated at times when people remain a mystery to them despite much research. One great example of that is Edmund Morris's struggles to understand Ronald Reagan. Morris, the famous biographer who's written so much about Teddy Roosevelt over time, also wrote the authorized biography of Ronald Reagan. He spent many years with the man and studied him through the history books, through his diaries, through interviews with scores of people in his administration, as well as people who had grown up with Ronald Reagan. But over time, he struggled to understand this man, who in many ways was aloof, maybe even more aloof than Washington with regard to his family, his peers, and his subordinates. And Morris admits that sometimes you can try to read too much into early childhood experiences in trying to explain the development of that personality, of that person who then is leading the nation in his 70s. He wrote at one point, "It's tempting to read more into a long-forgotten novel than Ronald Reagan probably did as a boy." He's referring to a novel that Reagan had read as a teenager and that in many ways did influence his thinking over time. But the question is, are we reading too much into that? Are we over-explaining his later behavior and his personality traits by virtue of just one experience in his childhood? Now, some people have tried to conduct more systematic studies across all of the presidents, rather than simply writing biographies of one or two men who held the office. Rubenzer and Fashionbauer published a psychological study in 2004 about U.S. presidents. They criticized biographers for subjective, non-professional, and idiosyncratic assessments of presidential personalities. They used techniques from the personality trait literature on leadership to develop a survey to be completed by a large group of experts. Their idea was to use people who understood psychology and psychiatry to really look at the minds and personalities of all the presidents. And their desire was to develop a typology. And that's what they did. In fact, after all of their surveys were completed, their analysis led them to a typology of 8 presidential types. The dominators, the first category: Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Andrew Jackson, and James Polk. The second category was the introverts: John Adams, his son John Quincy Adams, and later Herbert Hoover, Calvin Coolidge, and Woodrow Wilson, all presidents in the early 20th century. The good guys: Rutherford Hayes, Zachary Taylor, Dwight Eisenhower. The innocents: Warren Harding, Ulysses S. Grant. The actors: Ronald Reagan and Warren Harding. The maintainers: McKinley, the first George Bush, Gerald Ford, and Truman. The philosophers: Garfield, Lincoln, Jefferson, Madison, and Carter. And the extroverts: both Roosevelt's, John Kennedy, and Bill Clinton. Well, what do we make of that personality type inventory that these men were able to derive from their study of all the U.S. presidents? Well, it was a very controversial approach, as you might imagine, and there were many methodological limitations and issues that were raised with this study. But beyond criticizing their methodology, we have to take a look at the groupings that I just recited. What is clear is that you would have a very hard time drawing conclusions about performance from this personality type analysis. For instance, Andrew Jackson is considered a great by many historians, but he's lumped in the same category with Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, who often rate very poorly in surveys of political scientists. Similarly, they've put Ronald Reagan and Warren Harding together, and Abraham Lincoln and Jimmy Carter together. Again, presidents with far different performance results, and yet they're in the same personality category. So while we might, even if we were able to sort of accept that this typology is valid, we'd have to ask ourselves, what do we get from it? Are we able to predict performance by understanding personality type? And the answer is clearly not. Now this leads us to a broader discussion, which is the traits perspective on leadership. Many of the early studies of leadership, particularly after World War II, by academic scholars, looked at traits. That is, to a variety of individual attributes, such as personality, needs, motives, and values, to try to understand leadership. They also looked at skills. By skills, I mean the abilities to perform some task in an effective manner. Those skills might be of a technical, interpersonal, or conceptual nature. Traits and skills, as it turns out, are a function both of heredity and learning. That is to say, you're born with certain traits, but you also develop and modify them over time as you adapt to the environment in which you are raised and in which you work. So many studies looked at traits, tried to identify categories of them, and then tried to relate them to success, however they define success in various fields and endeavors. Now, what was the result of decades of research on personality traits? Well, in 1974, Stojdil created an interesting study. He did a meta-analysis of 163 major personality trait studies from 1949 through 1970. Reviewing several decades of research on leadership traits, he tried to understand what progress had been made in the field. What he found was startling. He saw no strong evidence of a set of universal leadership traits. Some traits seemed to maybe raise odds of success, but they were no guarantee at all. He also found that a leader with particular traits might be effective in one context, but not in another. And lastly, he saw that two people with a very different set of personality traits could succeed in the same situation. At the end of the day, he was left to conclude that not much real progress had been made in terms of predictive power of these studies of personality traits. That is to say, we weren't able to look at someone, categorize their personality, and then predict whether they would succeed as a leader in a particular context. Now, more recently, the Center for Creative Leadership has conducted new research looking at leaders. And what they've done is try to compare those who became derailed in their careers after a promotion versus those who had succeeded when promoted. In other words, they looked at people who were climbing the corporate ladder. And after a promotion, they tried to understand how many people then went on to new promotions and continued to climb versus those who had become derailed. And again, despite all of the research, they found no formula for success. There were no common set of traits that seemed to distinguish those who continued to climb versus those who had become derailed. They did find some important insights that they could share, though. They found some skills and competencies that seemed to define those who had avoided derailment. They seemed to indicate that these people were a little more emotionally stable, they had high integrity, and they had a nice blend of interpersonal skills as well as technical skills. But at the end of the day, these are not core personality traits that they could identify and correlate with success. Now, one other trend over the recent years in the literature on leadership has been to relook at how we define and categorize personality traits. Maybe if we come up with a different typology, we might have more predictive power. That at least was the argument. That was the attempt. And so scholars have attempted to synthesize and integrate all the various traits that have been identified and studied over the years and group them in a way into a smaller set of traits that might have more predictive power. And these 5 traits have been identified as surgency, conscientiousness, agreeableness, adjustment, and inelectance. How did they get to these 5 traits? Before I say another word about them, I'd like to just define the approach or describe the approach. And here what they did is use a statistical technique called factor analysis. They used a wide range of questions in order to assess people, and then they looked for clusters of similar traits so they could come up with this Big 5 typology. And by clustering various traits, they then were able to publish their results. What is surgency, the first of the Big 5? Well, it largely revolves around extroversion, energy, and the need for power. Are you an outgoing person who lights up a room? Are you the kind of person who easily engages in conversation at a meeting, a dinner, or a reception? The second trait was conscientiousness. Are you dependable? Do you have a need for achievement? Do you get things done on time and under budget? Agreeableness. Are you cheerful and helpful? Do you like to belong? Do you feel a need to be affiliated with groups and teams and organizations? Adjustment. Are you emotionally stable, or do you ride the roller coaster? Do you exercise self-control, and do you have self-confidence? And lastly, inelectance. Are you curious, open-minded? Do you strive to constantly learn new things, develop new skills, try out new behaviors? That was the last of these Big 5 personality type traits. Now, at the end of the day, as I say, there's been some controversy even around whether this typology is correct. and many people have criticized the statistical approach taken by these scholars. But again, even if we grant that this is the right 5 traits, that these clusters make sense, at the end of the day, it may have predictive power in some study here or there, but not overall. No consistent predictive power that we can see over the course of many years of research. So even if we grant that there's descriptive power in this Big 5, we aren't able to predict who will be a better leader than others. Finally, in the most recent studies, we've begun to shift away from looking at personality traits towards more behavioral work. And so Goleman has talked about emotional intelligence, and others have talked about social intelligence. This is sort of a blend of traits and behaviors. Emotional intelligence, for example, is the extent to which a person is attuned to their own feelings and those of others, and has the ability to apply reason and emotion in an integrated and balanced way. This idea of emotional intelligence caught fire over the last decade or so, and many corporations began to train their people and try to develop their emotional intelligence. Similarly, we have a lot of work that's been done in the social intelligence realm. By social intelligence, I mean the ability to determine how to approach a situation and what strategies to employ in an interpersonal conflict. Both of these are powerful, and they certainly have been used in helping to develop people as they progressed in their careers. But they're really not strictly personality traits. They're really this blend of trait and skill and capability. So where do we stand after all this work? Well, you have to ask yourself, have we made good progress or not? And I think at the end of the day, you have to realize there have been many challenges with the work on traits and skills. First, we have to ask, how are these traits interrelated? It's very hard to look at them in isolation, as many scholars have tried to do. To what extent is balance important? Is it really good to be super high or super low on any trait? Or really is the best thing to be somewhere in the middle? Is moderation actually optimal in many regards on personality traits? We also have to ask ourselves, if we believe that leadership is a shared activity, then all of this focus on the mind, on the personality of particular senior leaders, may very much be falling into that myth, that trap around the lone genius. And that really to understand the performance of an organization, even if we believe in the trait approach, we've got to look at the traits of the entire top team, not just the leader. And finally, and most importantly, there's the issue of situation or context. And this is one we'll look at in future lectures. That is to say, does it depend? Does the type of leader and the approach of that leader depend on the context in which they operate? And is it simply impossible to define some universal set of traits that apply across all contexts? Now, there's been a shift over the years away from traits to looking at what managers actually do, that is to say, to their behaviors. And these studies were descriptive in nature, trying to understand the nature of managerial work. They were not normative. They weren't trying to predict who was better than others or why some people had achieved high performance. Instead, they were looking for patterns of activity that all leaders engaged in. They did this through things such as diary studies and observational studies. They were going deep into the calendar of that individual and trying to understand exactly how they spent their day. Who did they talk to? What types of activities did they engage in? What was their role in the organization? Henry Mintzberg published perhaps one of the most famous studies in this regard. In the early 1970s, he published The Nature of Managerial Work. And in that, he defined a number of roles, which he clustered into 3 categories. He said as a leader, there are certain interpersonal roles that you play, such as a liaison to outside organizations or to different units in the organization. You also play the role of figurehead at times, representing in a symbolic way your organization to the world. There are a set of information processing roles that you play as well. You're monitoring performance. You're disseminating knowledge and information throughout the organization. And lastly, you play decision-making roles. You have to allocate resources. You have to negotiate between various units of the organization when there are conflicts. And you have to make tough choices, the hard call. Well, Mintzberg did a very nice job of categorizing these roles. At the end of the day, the problem is that we can't predict performance based on this taxonomy. Moreover, many of the observational and diary studies that were done on the nature of managerial work were done in the 1970s. You have to ask, are these very dated? After all, there's been a great deal of change in the nature of organizations, and there have been radical changes in technology over time. Let's take, for example, the fact that we now see organizations that look incredibly different than the large, bureaucratic, complex structures of the 1970s. We see companies like Google and Facebook with cultures that are much less hierarchical, with people operating without formal authority necessarily, shifting between roles with even much more ambiguity in roles, and yet high performance. And so many changes, and we have to wonder whether these early studies on the behaviors of leaders are applicable today. Think about the culture and the structure of your own organization. You have to ask, what do we conclude? I mean, if we look at Google and Facebook or the industrial giants of years past, do they require different kinds of leadership? To what extent should all organizations emulate the leaders in some of these new organizations that are successful, such as Google? Can we actually transfer the leadership approaches and the ways of working that exist in a place like Google to a large organization such as IBM or General Electric? So there are challenges with the behavioral perspective. Again, we have to ask, does leadership depend on the situation? Can we really come up with these universals, whether they be around traits or behaviors, that apply in all settings? One other approach that has garnered a great deal of attention in the early studies of leadership focuses not on traits, but on power and influence. Power is defined in these studies as the capacity of one party to influence another and to change behavior. Sometimes it's defined as the ability to get others to do what they otherwise would not do. And studies have focused on the amount and type of power possessed by a leader. And surveys have tried to relate leader power to various measures of effectiveness. And there's lots of focus in these studies on the influence tactics that leaders use. Some try to influence others in certain ways, and others use very different approaches. Now, we'll look at power in more detail in later lectures, but we certainly will note that there, again, have been no universals that have come out of that power literature in terms of trying to identify who will make a great leader and who won't, based on their approach to exercising power. More recently, what companies have done in terms of developing their leaders is move away from traits, understanding the limitations of those, and they focused on what they've called competency models. These are models used by human resource professionals throughout many organizations to not only help develop people during their careers, but also they've been used to try to evaluate people in things like merit reviews that happen on a regular basis. A competency model is a list of capabilities or skills, often organized into multiple clusters. And these competencies have moved away from focusing on innate traits towards defining the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of processes they want employees engaged in order to achieve high performance. At the end of the day, there's been some progress with these studies, with these competency models, because they have been helpful in giving people expectations, clear expectations of how they should perform, how they should behave in an organization. But as you'll see, if you actually review competency models, they're very different across organizations. And probably that's the right approach. Organizations need to define the kinds of behaviors and processes they want to see based on their strategy, based on their culture, based on the industry in which they compete. So competency models are effective both for setting expectations and evaluating employees, but they're very dependent on the context in which those employees operate. Well, back to Stodstill. He did that wonderful meta-analysis where he reviewed the literature on personalities, traits, and skills. And here's what he concluded. A person does not become a leader, he said, by virtue of the possession of some combination of traits. The pattern of personal characteristics of the leader must bear some relevant relationship to the characteristics, activities, and goals of the followers. What do we take away from this work, from this lecture where we've started with the early studies and tried to understand all their limitations? Well, clearly when evaluating leaders, we don't want to focus on a few personality traits. That's been an overarching theme. And remember that many different kinds of personalities can succeed as leaders. After all, if we look back to those American presidents that we talked about earlier, we see starkly different personalities when we talk about a Bill Clinton, a Ronald Reagan, a George Washington, or an Abraham Lincoln. Yet many of them succeeded in very different contexts, in very different environments, with very different traits. We said we want to shift from thinking about personality traits to behaviors, and we want to think about how those behaviors have to fit the culture and the environment in which employees and leaders are operating. And we said much progress has been made by human resource professionals and organizations in trying to think about that. And they've clustered their work into these competencies that make up a model of the kinds of expectations of behavior they have for their people. But there are three key questions that I think we need to ask about these competency models that organizations have adopted. And I would ask you now to consider these questions as you reflect on your own organization and the way you evaluate your own employees, or the way you are evaluated by others. How clear are you in communicating the behaviors you expect from your employees, from your followers? How much feedback do they receive? In other words, if they're not performing well, if they're not doing what the competency model expects of them, are they being told where they are deficient and where they are proficient? Are they being helped? Is there development? That's the last, final, critical question. Are we offering them a way to react to the feedback and seek out mentorship, coaching, and training so they can improve those competencies over time? Note where we've come. We started out talking about personality traits, things that are stable, things you're born with and that develop early in childhood. And now we're talking about competencies, a set of behaviors and processes that people can modify and adapt, that they can get feedback on, react to, in which they can learn new things and develop skills and improve their performance. And companies particularly, but also nonprofit institutions, are investing a great deal in trying to understand exactly how to assess people on various competencies and what are the most high leverage, powerful ways to develop those skills in their high potentials, the people who are going to potentially become the leaders of the future for the organization. Now, we've noted in this lecture several times that leadership is probably not about universals, but about situation dependency, that the right approach is critically dependent on the situation or context in which a leader operates. And in our next lecture, we're going to take a look at that notion in great detail. We will examine a number of models that have tried to be more precise about exactly how is the leadership approach dependent on situation, and what aspects of a situation are critical for determining how a leader should proceed. That's where we're going in our next lecture.